The leather reins slip through your trembling fingers. You're 12 years old, daughter of a Persian silk trader, and the Mongol scout circling your family's caravan moves like smoke over grass. His eyes pass over your father, your brothers, the guards with their useless swords, and stop on you. That look isn't hunger, it's calculation, the kind merchants use when pricing inventory. In 3 minutes, everyone you love will be dead. In 3 days, you'll wish you were. And in 3 years, you'll be raising a child whose eyes mirror the man who destroyed your world, speaking a language that tastes like ash on your tongue. This is 1271, somewhere between what was Samarkand and what will become a mass grave, and you're about to learn that survival can be a crueler fate than martyrdom. The Mongol Empire wasn't just history's largest continuous landmass under single rule. It was the most efficient converter of human beings into resources ever devised. Between 1206 and 1368, Mongol expansion created a supply chain of human cargo that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the borders of Vienna, processing millions of captives through a system so methodical it makes modern trafficking operations look improvisational. But while Hollywood gives us noble horsemen and strategic genius, the composite bows, the feigned retreats, the brilliant siege tactics, it systematically ignores the empire's most sustainable innovation, the industrialization of sexual slavery, not as collateral damage, as infrastructure. Because Genghis Khan understood something that separated him from every conqueror before him. Terror doesn't just soften resistance. Properly administered, it becomes self-replicating, and the most effective terror requires witnesses who survive long enough to spread it. The mathematics of Mongol conquest followed a pattern so consistent it appears in records from Baghdad to Kiev. After a city fell, and they always fell eventually, because the Mongols had perfected the art of making resistance more costly than surrender, the population was driven into open spaces, not plazas or marketplaces, but fields outside the walls where escape was visible and therefore more agonizing in its impossibility. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was sorting. Men were separated into groups. Those who possessed valuable skills, craftsmen, engineers, scribes, administrators, might live as slaves. Enemy soldiers and adult males without specialized knowledge were executed immediately, often forced to dig their own mass graves first. The killing was efficient, methodical, a sword stroke to the back of the neck, bodies toppling into ditches they'd spent their last hours excavating. But the women were where the real calculation began. They were evaluated like livestock at auction. Age, beauty, visible health, social status determined by clothing or jewelry. Young girls, roughly between 12 and 25, received the most scrutiny. Not from lust alone, though that certainly motivated the soldiers conducting the inspections, but from breeding logic. These were the captives who could be impregnated, who could produce the next generation of mixed-blood children who would inherit just enough Mongol identity to be useful. Older women with calloused hands might be kept for domestic labor. Pregnant women presented a problem. The Mongols often performed crude abortions on the spot, because a pregnant slave was slower, less controllable, and the child would remember its mother's true origins. The empire needed blank slates, not living connections to the past. In 1220, when the Mongols obliterated Nishapur after a siege arrow killed Genghis Khan's son-in-law, chroniclers recorded that every living thing was slaughtered, dogs, cats, even rats. Except the women. 40,000 were distributed among the army, recorded in administrative logs with the same precision used for tracking horses or weapons. Each warrior received a specific allotment based on rank. A common soldier might receive 2 or 3. A commander, dozens. These weren't spoils of war in the traditional sense. They were operational supplies, as necessary to the army's function as arrows or dried meat. The Persian historian Juvaini, who traveled through the region decades later, documented how the very ground remained stained with blood, how skulls formed pyramids that could be seen from miles away. But he also noted something else: the complete absence of women in the ruins. They'd been harvested, like wheat before winter. The journey from capture site to final destination was itself a filtering mechanism. Captives were bound in long chains, sometimes 100 women roped together at the neck, forced to march 20 miles daily across terrain that killed pack animals. No wagons for prisoners. Those were reserved for loot with tangible value. Many died during these forced marches from dehydration, exposure, or simple despair. The Mongols didn't slow down for the dying. They cut them loose from the chain and kept moving, leaving the bodies for wolves. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was selection pressure. Only the physically and mentally resilient survived the journey, which meant the Mongols were inadvertently breeding for trauma tolerance. The women who reached Karakoram or Samarkand, or the temporary camps that served as processing centers, had already proven themselves capable of enduring the unendurable. Armenian chronicles describe one particular convoy in 1236, after the fall of Georgia. 3,000 women were marched through mountain passes in winter, dressed in whatever they'd been wearing when captured. Most wore summer clothing. By the time they reached the slave markets of Tabriz, fewer than 800 remained alive. But those 800 had demonstrated something valuable: the capacity to suffer and continue. This resilience made them more valuable, not less. The Mongols understood that broken tools could be reforged, but shattered ones were useless. What makes the Mongol system particularly sophisticated is how thoroughly it destroyed identity before rebuilding it. Upon arrival at major hubs, Karakoram, the capital, became the empire's primary distribution center. Captives underwent what we might now recognize as systematic deprogramming. They were stripped of their clothing, which carried cultural and class markers, then bathed and examined for disease. Those who spoke the same language were deliberately separated. Names were changed or eliminated entirely. A noblewoman from Baghdad became simply the Arab woman, Tent 7. A Russian merchant's daughter became the blonde one who knows numbers. This erasure was strategic. Language connects people to their past, to their families, to their sense of self. Remove the language, and you remove the anchor to everything they were. The Mongols even controlled prayer. Christian captives could make the sign of the cross, but only in private, and only if they first prostrated themselves toward the Khan's tent. Muslim women could observe Ramadan, but fasting didn't exempt them from their duties. Jewish captives could keep dietary laws only if it didn't inconvenience their masters. This corrupted spirituality was perhaps the most elegant form of control, allowing just enough religious practice to prevent complete psychological collapse, but twisting it into a reminder of their subjugation. Faith became another chain. Genghis Khan's own household exemplified the system at its most elaborate. His 4 principal wives, Burte, Kulan, Yesui, and Yesugen, came from significant political alliances, marriages that cemented tribal loyalties. But historians estimate he accumulated between 500 and 1,000 secondary wives and concubines during his lifetime. Each one was a trophy from a specific conquest, a living catalog of the empire's expansion. When he defeated the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father decades earlier, he didn't just kill the men. He took the most beautiful women and girls into his personal yurts, forcing them to serve the son of the man their people had murdered. The psychological warfare in that act is almost elegant in its cruelty. Imagine being that woman, serving tea to the man who'd ordered your brother's execution, bearing his children, and knowing your only alternative was death in a far more brutal form. But the great Khan's collection was merely the visible tip of a continental machine. Every Mongol warrior expected his share. Victory wasn't measured just in territory or plunder, but in the number of women a man could claim. The most beautiful were reserved for the nobility, but even common archers received captives after successful campaigns. And here's where the system reveals its true genius. These women didn't just serve sexual functions. They became cooks, seamstresses, translators, nurses, and eventually mothers to children who would speak Mongol as their first language and identify with their father's people rather than their mother's. The empire was breeding cultural Mongols from foreign genetic stock, creating a population that looked like the conquered but thought like the conquerors. The sexual violence wasn't sporadic or undisciplined. It was scheduled and systematic. Women designated as concubines were trained, yes, trained, in the expectations of their masters. Resistance was met with public punishment designed to educate other captives. One Persian chronicle describes a woman who refused a Mongol officer being tied to stakes and gang-raped by his entire unit while other captives were forced to watch. Not as recreation, but as instruction. The message was clear. This is what resistance costs. Cooperation might not bring dignity, but it could minimize suffering. Many women made that calculation. Others chose different escapes. Suicide rates among newly captured women were catastrophic, though Mongol overseers quickly learned to implement preventive measures, posting guards during the night and confiscating anything that could be used as a weapon, including eating utensils and clothing ties. The Mongols also developed a currency of human flesh. Women could be traded between warriors like playing cards, gambled away in dice games, or used to settle debts. A particularly beautiful captive might change hands a dozen times before finding a permanent owner. Chinese administrative records from the Yuan dynasty describe elaborate accounting systems tracking these transactions, with women assigned monetary values based on age, appearance, and skills. A literate woman who could keep household accounts was worth 3 times more than an illiterate peasant. A virgin girl of noble birth might be valued at 10 times that. The empire had created a comprehensive pricing structure for human beings. Children born from these forced unions occupied a strange legal and social space. They were neither fully Mongol nor entirely foreign, existing in a twilight category that the empire deliberately cultivated. These mixed-blood children became interpreters, administrators, and cultural bridges that held the empire together. A boy born to a Chinese mother and Mongol father could navigate both worlds, making him invaluable for tax collection in occupied territories. A girl born to a Russian mother might be married off to a local chieftain as part of a diplomatic arrangement, carrying Mongol bloodline and loyalty into another generation. The Mongols were playing a genetic long game that wouldn't fully materialize for decades, but they understood inheritance in ways that their contemporaries didn't. Some of these children rose to remarkable positions. Bolad Akka, born to a captured Chinese concubine, became one of Kublai Khan's most trusted advisors. His mixed heritage made him perfect for administering Chinese territories under Mongol rule. But his success came at a price: complete rejection of his mother's heritage, adoption of Mongol customs, and participation in campaigns that conquered more Chinese cities. The system turned victims into perpetrators, creating a self-sustaining cycle of oppression. Modern genetic research has confirmed what the chronicles suggested. A 2003 study found that approximately 16 million men alive today, roughly 0.5% of the global male population, carry Y chromosome markers consistent with Genghis Khan's lineage. That's not conquest. That's a biological empire. But here's what the genetics also reveal. The mitochondrial DNA, which passes through the maternal line, tells a different story. It shows massive genetic diversity among the mothers, women drawn from dozens of distinct populations across Eurasia. The genetic signature is unmistakable. Mongol men systematically impregnated women from every culture they encountered, while Mongol women rarely interbred with foreign men. This wasn't accidental. It was policy, enforced through laws that made sexual relations between Mongol women and foreign men punishable by death, while encouraging Mongol men to take as many foreign women as they could control. The processing centers that developed at major crossroads became increasingly sophisticated. At Karshi, in what's now Uzbekistan, archaeological evidence suggests a massive compound dedicated to sorting and distributing captives. Stone foundations indicate barracks that could house thousands. separate bathhouses for cleaning new arrivals, and administrative buildings where scribes maintained detailed registries. These weren't primitive holding pens. They were logistics hubs, operating with the same efficiency as the empire's postal stations or military supply depots. Women arrived in chains and departed as property, assigned to specific owners with paperwork that tracked their movement across the empire. But documentation also reveals something else. A small percentage of women achieved something resembling autonomy within the system. Those who bore sons, particularly sons who showed military or administrative talent, could leverage that into improved status. Some became trusted household managers, eventually overseeing other slaves. A few even appear in records as minor landholders, granted small estates by masters who valued their organizational skills. This wasn't liberation. It was the system's most insidious feature, offering just enough possibility of improvement to make cooperation seem rational. The empire created a hierarchy of suffering where even the enslaved had incentive to enforce the rules on those below them. There's a letter preserved in the Mongolian state archives, written in Persian script, from a former captive named Shirin to her new master's household steward. She's requesting permission to discipline another slave, a recently captured girl from her own hometown, for spreading discontent. The letter is businesslike, professional. Shirin had become an accomplice in her own people's subjugation, and the letter suggests she performed her duties without hesitation. The system hadn't just broken her body, it had reprogrammed her loyalty. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in 1241 brought these practices to populations utterly unprepared for industrialized human trafficking. When the Mongols swept through Poland and Hungary, they introduced a level of systematic captivity that medieval Europeans had never experienced. Entire villages were emptied, every woman and child bound and marched eastward while the buildings burned behind them. Chronicles describe roads clogged with columns of captives stretching for miles, guarded by relatively few Mongol soldiers because where could they run? The steppe offered no shelter, no food, no hope. European knights who'd spent careers fighting over castles and feudal rights suddenly faced an enemy that didn't want territory. It wanted inventory. Some communities chose annihilation over capture. There are records of mass suicides, whole families drowning themselves in rivers or setting fire to their homes with everyone inside. Because by 1241, stories had already spread, stories of what happened to women taken by the Mongols. Stories so horrible that death seemed preferable. This is what terror as policy achieves. It makes populations destroy themselves before you even arrive. A Polish chronicle describes a village where mothers smothered their own daughters rather than let them be taken. The psychological devastation of that choice, killing your child to save her from something worse, is almost incomprehensible. But it happened repeatedly across Eastern Europe in the spring of 1241. The empire's collapse in the late 13th and early 14th centuries scattered this system across successor states, but didn't dismantle it. The Golden Horde continued trafficking Slavic captives through Crimean ports well into the 15th century. The Ilkhanate in Persia maintained elaborate slave markets in Tabriz. The Yuan dynasty in China kept foreign concubines as status symbols for centuries. The Mongols had introduced a technology of oppression that proved too valuable for their successors to abandon. Even the Ottoman Empire, which absorbed much of the western Mongol territories, adopted similar systems for managing captive populations. The Janissaries, Christian boys taken from their families and raised as Muslim soldiers, were a direct evolution of Mongol practices. What haunts the historical record most isn't the scale, though the scale defies comprehension, it's the precision. This wasn't passionate violence or chaotic brutality. It was administered suffering, carefully calibrated to achieve specific outcomes. Break them just enough to ensure compliance, but not so much they become useless. Erase their past completely, but preserve their utility. Breed them for characteristics that serve the empire's needs. The Mongols turned human beings into a renewable resource, harvesting each generation and replanting the next. The legal codes they developed reveal this calculated approach. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's law code, contained specific provisions regarding the treatment of slaves. A master who killed his own slave faced no punishment, but killing another man's slave required compensation at market value. Slaves could be sold, traded, or inherited like any other property, but slaves who demonstrated exceptional loyalty could be freed, though freedom within the Mongol system simply meant a different category of servitude. The law recognized humans as property while maintaining enough flexibility to reward useful behavior. It was slavery as social engineering. 8 centuries later, their genetic legacy walks in the bodies of hundreds of millions of people who carry those bloodlines without knowing the circumstances of their origin. The trauma legacy lives in folklore and collective memory, in stories that parents still tell children about the horsemen from the East. And the methodological legacy appears in every subsequent regime that learned you could process human beings like commodities if you were organized enough, ruthless enough, and willing to think in generations rather than years. They built the largest empire in human history on the bodies of women whose names nobody recorded. They proved that systematic dehumanization could become infrastructure, that sexual violence could be weaponized into statecraft, that cruelty at sufficient scale achieves a kind of permanence. The question isn't whether they succeeded. The evidence is written in chromosomes and chronicles alike. Somewhere in the archives in Ulaanbaatar, there's a 14th century census document listing property holdings of a minor Mongol official. Between notations for livestock and grain stores, 3 lines record foreign women, household use, adequate condition. No names, no origins. The ink is faded now, the paper brittle, but the words are still legible, still counting, still reducing human beings to inventory entries in a ledger that spans continents.